Good evening and welcome to this latest episode in the Elephant's ongoing series, debating some of the issues that arise out of the COVID-19 crisis, politically, economically, and socially. And this evening, I am honored to have with me, all the way from London, fellow Kenyan and friend, Waikwa Wanyoike, who many will have heard of. Waikwa is a lawyer by training, and he's the founding executive director of the Katiba Institute, which is a well-known NGO here, really a pioneering organization in terms of public interest litigation in Kenya. He founded that together with Professor Yashpal Gai and Jill Gai, who are two stalwarts and leaders in terms of the constitution in Kenya. Currently, Waikwa works with the Open Society Foundation in London as the Director for Strategic Litigation. The Katiba Institute will be known by many Kenyans for some of the landmark cases that they have successfully prosecuted. For example, challenging the Lamu port and getting a 1.7 billion shilling payment ordered to the community. They also intervened and stopped the Lamu coal plant, which was another controversy at the coast. And Katiba Institute, under Waikwa's leadership, also took a lead in protecting the interests and defending the interests of indigenous forest communities in Kenya, who've been long marginalized. And there are a number of other really outstanding pieces of litigation that Katiba Institute undertook when Waikwa was executive director of Katiba. So, karibu this evening, Waikwa.
Asante sana, John. Really good to see you, and thanks for having me.
How, just let me start by asking, how are you doing? How's the family? COVID-19, I can see lots of books behind you. Is that where you're basically working from? And how's the family? How's your health? How's life generally? And the lockdown?
No, I'm doing very well. Everybody is doing very well. Of course, UK has been one of those places which has been affected a lot by COVID, but we've been lucky. Nothing significant other than the usual social distancing and stuff. And interestingly enough, we've also had very good weather, even when we are locked indoors. So can't complain.
That's in London, that is quite a unique situation. So well done. Let me launch straight into it, Waikwa, because my interest was piqued by an article that was published in The Elephant, where you gave a rather grim prognosis for the Building Bridges Initiative effort to change the constitution. And I wanted to ask you a question, because it's now at the forefront of the Kenyan imagination politically, that the handshake, the Building Bridges Initiative. There's now talk of constitutional changes, perhaps needing a referendum to carry them out, to create ostensibly a more inclusive government with expanding the executive, etc. There are a number of proposals that have been floating about, but we haven't seen the actual report. But I wanted you, as somebody who has studied and litigated around such grand constitutional issues considerably in the past, if you can give me your take. Is the BBI doable? Is referendum doable? Our politicians are very busy organizing around it. What do you think?
Just to go to, first of all, to the article that you're referring to, the thesis of that article was mostly that I did not believe that we would have constitutional changes before August 2022. And August 2022 is critical because that's the constitutional date for the next general election. And why that is important, obviously, is that politics run in cycles. If you don't achieve legislative or constitutional amendment agenda by the time Parliament leaves office, then that project is mostly forgotten. Remember, we will have change in leadership, or we hope to have change in leadership, which also means that the political alignments will likely change, priorities will change, even assuming some of the individuals who are involved with advocating for BBI actually end up taking leadership post August 2022. Their interests, I think, will change significantly. So that date is critical in terms of thinking what is possible. It's also critical for another reason. In terms of building momentum for constitutional change. It's all about political mobilization. Yes. What is more important for politicians, in my view, closer to 2022 will not be about constitutional amendment. It will be more about leadership and taking over leadership. Yeah. So, for example, one of the things I was asking, if assuming we get to late next year, early 2022, when the political campaigns are at a very high notch for August 2022, and Raila Odinga is presented with the option of choosing between BBI or presidential campaign, what do we expect him to choose? And does he have the luxury to choose both in knowing the resources and the time that is needed? And so that becomes critical. But my argument was that was also that I don't think politicians who've been pushing this, and maybe they do understand the complexity, but I don't think they fully appreciate the complexity of amending our constitution. And that complexity gets presented in different ways, whether it's the constitutional procedure of amending the constitution, whether it's the political mobilization I was talking about, or whether it's the process itself.
If I was to ask Waikwa, say the BBI report is published tomorrow with a whole raft of changes to the executive, etc., some of the ones that we've been reading about, that require a constitutional change. What's the process, and why are you arguing it's so challenging?
So the process, the constitutional procedure is that if BBI report is published tomorrow, for purposes of the constitution doesn't consider that anything has been happening so far. So this is all wasted seasons, as I would call it, because the constitution only recognizes the process of amendment of the constitution when a bill is tabled in Parliament. That's when time starts running. Then you ask yourself, how much time? So the first procedure is that the bill is tabled in Parliament. Then it's put in a deep freezer for at least 3 months before it's read for the second time. That's what the Constitution requires. During that time, the politicians and other people who are interested in the bill can do public consultation. The fact that BBI has been doing public consultation or has been claiming to be doing public consultation, that doesn't count because it's not located within the procedure of constitutional amendment. Remember, so you run, let's assume you introduce it in the National Assembly because you have to choose which house to introduce it. You have to wait for 3 months after the introduction before you go to the second reading and the third reading. Okay. So you are talking at least in one house, a period of anywhere between 3.5 months, considering the administrative processing, to 4 months. Then you have to take it to the next house and it has to run the same cycle.
So it goes from Parliament to the Senate?
Yes. So National Assembly to the Senate, or if it starts at the Senate, it has to come to the National Assembly and run the same cycle. So at the minimum, you are looking at 8 months, and that is assuming that everything runs smoothly. There are no objections, there are no, all these things that can happen that ordinarily will delay the process. So at the minimum, we are looking at everything running smoothly, not earlier than August next year for just the parliamentary process. We haven't talked about the next process, which is the referendum, which also has its own timeline. And even assuming the bill passes at referendum, it still has to sit for 30 days when anybody can challenge it before it becomes law. So in essence, even in the smoothest process requires about a year to complete.
Say of course, those who are planning for all these things have also considered, have read the article and have gone back to the drawing table. And thinking perhaps we can make these changes without having to change the constitution. Is it possible? Is it possible to expand the executive without changing the constitution? Is it possible to appoint, which has already happened, to appoint politicians as cabinet secretaries, principal secretaries, etc.? Is it possible for the spirit of BBI to be implemented while avoiding the constitutional challenges that you have just outlined?
Some things you can do by what we call just coloring, which means you don't end up getting the substantial changes you need. So let me give you an example. Nothing today stops Uhuru Kenyatta from appointing Raila Odinga and naming him the chief minister, right? Nothing.
Nothing.
We can have a debate whether Uhuru Kenyatta can appoint Odinga or anyone else and call him or her prime minister, because then that denotes something, even in the political parlance, in legal parlance. So we can debate that. But there are certain things you can't change. So for example, you can't name politicians as cabinet ministers because the constitution has explicitly said you can't do that. So you need a constitutional amendment. It's the kind of constitutional amendment that would require a referendum. So you can't just do it using parliament. So even, and this is why they've not been able to do much, because when you think about it, the kind of substantial changes they've been promising and the ones that they've primed the public, especially the supporters, on require substantial constitutional changes for them to have substantial effect that they've promised. And that would require not just a parliamentary amendment process, but also a process that goes through a referendum.
Clearly, some of the changes that are being contemplated from what you're explaining, whether they go the constitutional route or they decide to do the painting, the panel beating route, are all open to legal challenge. People can can go to court and raise issues in their regard. I'll be keen on your perspective vis-a-vis the judiciary in Kenya, which has often in the more recent past seemed under siege from the executive, with ever since the president made that statement after the September 1st, 2017 ruling of the Supreme Court that nullified the election, that the president said, this issue shall be revisited. And there's been all travail and tribulations ever since then, with many, number of statements being made by the Chief Justice that indicate challenges in that area. I know there's also been recommendations being made from different quarters about the composition and location of the Judicial Service Commission, and I'd be keen on your impressions and your comments, your insights vis-a-vis the judiciary since promulgation of this constitution and the kind of challenges they're facing, and how we move forward.
So two very quick points first. The first one is about trying to find a roundabout route to effect changes without following the constitutional procedure, whether it's either even amending the constitution, so for example, legislating certain things instead of amendment, or using a parliamentary process instead of a process that requires referendum. But our constitution is very clear, and the courts have been very clear that when the court is determining whether there has been a violation of the constitution, it looks at two things. It looks at whether there has been violation in purpose or there has been violation in effect. So, for example, and this is why I was giving the example of prime minister, to the extent that you create a prime minister position but assign some of the presidential duties to the prime minister, you've violated the constitution both in purpose and the effect, because now the effect is you've taken away powers that were given to the president and given them to somebody else without following the due process required by the constitution. Now, the second point, which is the judiciary. I know as a fact that the Uhuru Kenyatta and Jubilee has not been happy with the judiciary for obvious reasons, because the judiciary at least has been mostly consistent as the guardrail to protect the constitution. And we know the judiciary has issued significant judgments and ruling to ensure that the executive follows the constitution. And I know within BBI, there are a lot of people who are interested in bringing changes to the judiciary, both as a tool of control of the judiciary, but two, as what you referred to as a punishment, the revisiting that we all know about. But the beauty is that anything that touches on the independence of the judiciary, and that would include, for example, trying to tinker even with how JSC members are appointed, that must go to a referendum. So you need the longer process. You cannot change that using the law. The president has already tried to do that. So for example, by allocating himself powers of choosing between different candidates for the position of Chief Justice, when in 2016, they amended the Judicial Service Act and provided, instead of the Judicial Service Act just providing one candidate for the recommendation as Chief Justice, they need to provide multiple candidates. The court said, no, that's not what the Constitution says. So they cannot, they could, I'm not saying they can't, but those roundabout ways would be found most likely to be unconstitutional. So, and that is the frustration that I think BBI is facing. We've seen articles, including by leading members of BBI, talking about the changes that we need in the judiciary. We've seen the Speaker of the National Assembly give an extensive memorandum on to the BBI on the changes he wants. But the reality is, the people, that decision, whether to change or not, will have to be decided not just by members of parliament, where it's even contentious how many people or how many members they can mobilize, but has to go to the people. And I am not, I don't do crystal ball, but I'm sure that people do appreciate the role that judiciary has played in protecting their constitution. And this is a people's constitution. It's not an elite constitution. And when it comes to a referendum or a plebiscite, I think that will be reflected in how people react. But let's be realistic, John. I don't think we're having a referendum. I would want to see that happen and see how I can be contradicted in terms of timing and all these other factors. But I don't even think we are getting to a referendum, at least not this time.
Thanks. I wanted to ask another question, and it's just basically to get your views on the legal provenance of the fact that this administration has appointed more officers from the military and from the intelligence services to positions in the executive than any other administration in Kenya's history. What are the implications for that, just for Kenyan constitutionalism? And are there, also vis-a-vis the letter of the Constitution?
Let's maybe start with the basic. What are the different ways to get a job in public service? The law only provides, or the Constitution only provides for 3 ways. One, through elective office, so MCAs and members of parliament.
Yes.
And the president, and I guess the deputy president, the governors. So the elected officials. 2, through a merit-based process, either superintended by the Public Service Commission, which oversees most of the merit-based process for people to join the public service, or different entities or agencies of the state have been given that power. So county governments also have their Public Service Commission, but they have to do competitive recruitment process, as the Judiciary does through the Judicial Service Commission, Parliament through Parliamentary Service Commission, name it. And the defense forces have a process because they are recognized by the Constitution to recruit military officers and other officers they require. The third option, which is very, very limited, is only provided to the president and to governors for personal, what the law refers to as personal staff. So advisors and such. Just people the president needs because of the nature of his work, not to be able to hire permanent secretaries or other substantial position. So the question then becomes, how do you move a military person who was hired because the skills one assumes they have the skills needed to discharge the obligations of somebody in the military? How do you move him or her direct to a position that should be recruited for either by public service or the county public board without following any process? It's illegal. It's illegal. So, because that's how people like Bandi, who is now running Nairobi Metropolitan Services, have been recruited. And I'm hearing, in fact, I was surprised. I thought it was only Badi who was in Nairobi. I understand it's about 7 very senior military officers. Remember, the military is also subject to the Constitution, including following values and principles. So I'm not saying that if you're in the military, you can never come and be in public service in Nairobi County or public service in the national government. But what I'm saying is that you have to leave the military and go and compete with other people for the position, right? Remember, as a starting point also, the manner in which the takeover was done was illegal. And in fact, courts have already found that that process was illegal. So there's so many illegalities. This is what we call compounding illegalities.
Yes.
That it becomes very hard to even try and disentangle, because it's not just illegalities, it's based on contumacious disregard of court orders. But we also have seen propensity of Kenyatta to just assign military or ex-military officers to other agencies of the state. For me, to the extent that those people have retired, I have no problem. They should compete like any Kenyan. But to the extent that they're still within the military, they cannot do that. That is going against not just the letter of the Constitution, but the spirit of the Constitution. Kenya, remember, is not just a civilian state, but the Constitution is explicit that the sovereignty is with the people. It's not with the military authorities, it's not with the executive authority. That is only donated.
So Mr. Sonko may be right. I mean, he says that he was a bit drunk, he was very drunk, and he saw zigzag, and would not have signed it if he was not that drunk. So he may have a point in terms of ultimately.
Yeah, but Sonko obviously is more confused than any Nairobian that I know about. It's a shame that Sonko is still the governor. So Sonko has his own issues, but that doesn't mean that just because Sonko is infirm in so many ways, he's clueless in so many ways, he's a comedian who've managed somehow to become governor of the most critical county in the nation in terms of whether it's GDP or just control of political power. It doesn't mean that if you need to get him out of office or reduce his powers, that you should not follow the legal process. There are legal process. Remember, there was an impeachment process that was going to go on. And what we understand is this was a quid pro quo. You support my bringing the military to run the city, and I find ways to tell the MCAs to withdraw the impeachment motion, which in itself is actually a violation of the Constitution to the extent that that is what happened.
Thank you, Waikwa. Time flies, and I have a couple of questions. Just wanted again to get your opinion on, as you know, there was and continues to be a considerable amount of debate in the Senate around the division of revenue, and this slogan that has been coined and has been propagated of 1 man, 1 vote, 1 shilling. And an attempt to bring in a formula failed in the Senate, and it remains contentious. I wanted to get your opinion as a constitutional lawyer and somebody who has litigated around these kinds of issues of equity, as a core of your work, especially when you are at Katiba. What your opinion is around this ongoing contentious debate here in Kenya?
So first of all, I have to say it was heartwarming. I've never watched Senate proceedings since we got Senate now, coming to 7-8 years. I don't remember the last time I ever watched the National Assembly proceedings. I don't think I've ever watched National Assembly since Jubilee came into power. But I found myself watching the last bit of the voting on the Kenyatta motion. And it was heartwarming to see that motion defeated. I know the substantive motion still is coming up, but this was a big win. I wish we had more time to break that down a bit. Heartwarming because it was really a reflection of how the Constitution should work. Okay. One, if you look at the way the senators voted, it wasn't based on the false dichotomy we've been given about Uhuru Raila and Ruto. As many of people who would identify with Ruto voted to support the motion as voted to defeat the motion. It was really based on assessment, I think, of county interest by senators, but also senators who went beyond county and thought about nationalism, issues of equity and such. When you think about why people like Sakaja, Murkomen were not my favorite politicians, but you have to give it to them. It was a mark or a demonstration of nationalism. But I have a fundamental problem with the debate because we're having the wrong debate.
Okay.
Remember, we're only talking about 15 billion. That is what is in contention here, right?
Yes.
And it's significant, yes, because some counties would probably suffer up to about 30% if the formula is applied of their budgets would go. So it's significant. Counties like Lamu, which gets between 2 to 3 billion in shareable revenue. So it can be extremely significant. So I don't want to minimize that. But remember the constitution anticipated, or requires, not anticipated, requires that counties be funded properly. What has been happening is, or the debate we should be happening, is whether the sharing of revenue has been equitable. Let me give you an illustration. The 2020 budget, if you see the reflection in the Division of Revenue bill and later the Act of the amount of national or revenue collected nationally, it's about 1.8 trillion. Yes. The budget itself is 2-point-something trillion because there is all these other monies, whether it's money that comes as grants, aid, loans, and things like that. Of 1.8 million, the shareable bit is about 1.8 trillion rather. The shareable bit is 1.5 trillion. The reason it's reduced is because under the Constitution, there is what they call the national interest and national obligations. So the way the process works in terms of division of revenue is they look at things that they cannot just allocate to either national government or county government because they go beyond national government and county government. So for example, Judiciary, it's a shared institution. So they place that under the national interest or the national obligation. It's a scheming of process. So they scheme off the top layer and whatever is left is what is divided. What has the National Treasury been doing? The National Treasury has found a crafty and very deceptive way of reducing that amount by allocating money or allocating money to services that actually are national government services or functions and characterizing them as county governments. So by the time you're getting to the shareable, they've skimmed off and put here or managed to sneak in a lot of their responsibilities. And let me give you one such responsibility. Think about education, primary and secondary school. That responsibility goes to the national government.
Yes.
So who should pay teachers for secondary and primary school? It's national government. But look at where they derive their TSC budget from. And especially, there might be a commission budget that should be that should go to the both levels. But teachers' salary should be going to the national government. Yes. I'm not saying that teachers shouldn't be paid. It's just locating the money where it should be, the national government. So by the time you're getting to the amount to divide between national and county, you've taken so much of and allocated a lot of functions of national government to what they call national interest or national obligation, that the amount is so little. And that is where the fight should be, to make sure that the actual shareable pot is bigger and there is no stealing that is happening by the national government.
Thank you. Thanks. Just one final question, which is just sort of to give this debate something of a more regional perspective, because there's a sense in which COVID has stripped us naked. So our governance systems are now having to function in an emergency situation. And I know that you've been following, whereas we've seen during this period major democratic reversals that are still underway under the cover of COVID, and many of the measures that have been implemented have augmented that. At the same time, we've seen changes on the African continent that are quite heartening in Sudan, in Ethiopia. We have an ongoing state capture commission in South Africa, which I wanted to ask you, as somebody who follows these issues of constitutionalism and accountability, especially how we Africans are able to hold our leaders to account, because that's the ultimate. Even the new constitution, the reintroduction of multi-party politics, were all sort of determined attempts by the ordinary Kenyans to hold our leadership to account. And I wanted to ask you for your reflections on how events in Sudan, South Africa, even Malaysia, where we've seen some very interesting actions taken, and just your perspectives on how they, what lessons we as Kenyans should be able to glean from them.
I think quite fundamental. I should have said, now that you talked about COVID, in my BBI analysis, I didn't even factor the fact that COVID just complicates things even more. But let's go to your question. I once asked Firoz Nology why they kept going back to the court during Moi's time, knowing that they would lose every time. Yeah. And his response to me was, Waikwa, because creating a record is extremely important. When you look at what's happening globally in terms of accountability, it tells you why, even when we seem to be losing some of these fights, political fights, we go to court, we get orders, but they are not implemented, why it's still important to persist. It's important to persist because you create a record. If you look at the South African situation, for example, in relation to state capture and the problems that Jacob Zuma, for example, has been facing, it's because people have been persistent in insisting on accountability. Look at Bashir. People kept record and they became persistent, and the moment showed up, and now they're able to hold him accountable. Look at Malaysia and the former prime minister being convicted in the 1MDB scandal. So all these things tells you that as long as you persist, and as long as you keep creating record and you protect what you have, which is why it's so important to protect against the amendment of the Constitution, a moment is likely going to come when you can be able to have the tools, the facility, and the environment for accountability. But the last point on this, it's options are also running, all options are running thin for these corrupt individuals, dictators, and such. If you look at the current trend, a lot of them, even when they steal, they're stashing their loot in the Middle East. Yes. They are no longer bringing money to Europe because, especially of universal jurisdiction application, they're not taking money to US because of all manner of laws that apply in relation to corruption. You would know, for example, because this is your area of expertise, the Magnitsky laws, the Aryan torts laws, and all that. Yes. And so it's becoming more and more complicated. So for me, it's just a question of persisting, looking at how other people or learning from what other people are doing, creating records, and at the right moment, we will demand accountability as we are in different other parts of the world.
So eternal vigilance is the key.
Eternal vigilance, and Malawi is probably the latest good example. The Chief Justice, if the Law Society hadn't gone to court, the Chief Justice would have probably left office before the new regime came into power. And look at the first order of business was to nullify that the forced retirement of the Chief Justice. So okay. I think it's important for us to take heart and know that the moment of accountability will eventually come. Ask Netanyahu.
Yes, indeed. On that positive note, thank you very much, Waikwa Wanyoike, all the way from London. Asante sana for giving us your time this evening. I'm sure we'll be calling on you again because events are moving fast, not only in Kenya, but around the region. And from your vantage point in London, the kind of program you're running, I know you're following events in a range of other countries that we can learn from as Kenyans. So I'd like to say asante sana for your time this evening, and we'll be coming back to you.
Asante sana, John. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.